Hello everybody, and welcome back. One of the last few things that I have the passion to talk about Deep Rock Galactic is arguing with people online about stuff that doesn't really matter. What we're talking about today is more of a focal point for a wider issue in Deep Rock, but I think this is a pretty good example. What we're going to be talking about is Hipster. A lot of this stems from me wanting this thing to be nerfed in the first place, but that's not really what I'm advocating here for today. It's a long-running conversation about whether Hipster is good, bad, somewhere in the middle, worse than nothing, or even overpowered. Deep Rock is a pretty difficult game to weigh things in their exact power, potency, relevancy, and this is because the value of bringing any certain piece of equipment, any class, any minuscule choice that you make, and its value is entirely determined by random chance. Whether this be how many of a certain type of enemy you encounter in a mission, a random event that you may or may not encounter in a mission, as well as the actions, skill sets, equipment, and minuscule choices made by your fellow players. This leads to a pretty heinous lack of competency from a lot of people talking about balance and just overall power of certain equipment in the game, because it's very easy to load into a sandbox, spawn two Tri-Jaws, shoot them both in the weak point with focus shots, and say, okay, focus shots are better at HVTs. And while on a fundamental level you might be able to say, yeah, shooting two Tri-Jaws in the weak points and killing them instantly is a pretty good benefit, but when you weigh that with the overall function fluctuation of a certain build, certain overclock, and certain role that the M1000 is going to be playing across the whole scope of the game, every possible event you can encounter, every team composition you can play in, and the gear that your teammates are bringing, oversimplifying it to a point of saying, look, it hits a breakpoint is incredibly weak, disingenuous, and poor intellectual practice. One of the only major changes that Hipster has undergone since Update 34 is the input buffer change to make it so it is more consistently spammable and there's less chance of the stuttering when firing it. This came along with a reduction in the overall fire rate of Hipster from 7 to 6. Now, I'm not here to pitch you a bunch of numbers, be a spreadsheet warrior, or tell you the exact probabilities of this, that, or another thing happening. But something we will talk about is breakpoints. Not necessarily all of them, but that is the major condemnation that most people have for Hipster, so I think it's worth bringing up here. And I think that would be a valid complaint up until the point that you learn the potential and how to utilize Hipster to play better than base M1K. If you've been playing Active Stability System for hundreds of hours, and then you switch over to Hipster, and all of a sudden you aren't able to focus shot that Tri-Jaw and one-shot it, that's gonna feel like a pretty harsh downside. And I would agree with you that it is, if you play that way. The first thing that I want to talk about in sort of a categorical way is overall weapon performance and flexibility. I've heard the term flexibility and lack thereof used to condemn Hipster for the things that it loses the ability to do versus a focus shot or unoverclocked M1000. A lot of people would consider it to be less flexible because you can no longer focus shot a grunt to the body, or you have to hit a grunt in the weak point and you can't two-shot them with hip shots, or you have to take certain mods to reach certain breakpoints. And once again, whenever the argument is presented as Hipster losing the ability to do something, I think that's an agreeable point. But like I said earlier, that's very disingenuous when it comes to the value of what you're gaining versus the value of what you're losing. So let's talk about the overall performance of M1000. Regardless on how you actually build a weapon, you always have access to uncharged shots and charged shots. Depending on how you spec the weapon and which overclock you take will determine the actual value of charged shots. Without any mod bonuses or overclocks playing in their favor, focus shots are literally just putting two bullets into one and increasing the punishment for missing that shot. And I don't think it's unreasonable to say that most M1000 builds lean into charge shots, either directly in their overclock and the reward and what it affects, and also just the mod tree in general has a lot of benefits for charge shots or things that happen whenever you shoot or land charge shots. And I think that's why there's such a strong aversion to Hipster from the outset, is because it's basically the only thing about the weapon that doesn't care about focus shots. This turns your method of aiming with the M1000 from a moment-to-moment accuracy weapon to a weapon that rewards tracking. Taking TF2 for an example, the sniper only needs to be aiming at the head of the enemy whenever they pull the trigger. It's a sniper rifle. It only does damage when you shoot. Versus something like the heavy, which has, for the most part, a non-stop firing primary weapon. Meaning that the more time your crosshair spends on top of an enemy, and in DRG's case, a weak point, the more damage you're able to do. And that's why I feel like Hipster takes so many people off guard, is because it heavily, and more greatly than any other overclock, rewards tracking enemies consistently rather than momentarily hitting them. As soon as an enemy ends up under your crosshairs, they're going to be taking significantly more damage than you could ever put out with focus shots, barring something like Super Cooling Chamber, which has its own drawbacks. So what we lose with Hipster. We lose the ability to one-shot grunts in the weak point unless we take weak point damage in tier 4, which I think is the correct choice to take regardless. Taking blow-through on Hipster is just unnecessary, and missing out on that increased damage against all weak points in the game is just unreasonable. We take damage in the first tier as Hipster's ammo economy is already broken wide open and that it's very nearly double that of the base weapon. In my experience, there's no need to take the recoil dampening in tier 2, so taking the armor break is just the logical choice. It allows us to be more hapless and have faster and easier kills through armor. And in tier 3, since we don't use that many charge shots with Hipster, we'll get to that in a minute, we're going to take the larger magazine. Like I said, tier 5 is kind of up in the air, but since our focus shots aren't being buffed in any way, they're essentially just 2 bullets fired at once, there's really no reason to take Precision Tear unless you just really need the extra fear, so we're going to be taking Stun for a purely utilitarian purpose. Now, I'm not going to go over every single breakpoint that we miss because they're all sort of rectified in the same way. Any breakpoint that we miss by taking Hipster has the same solution. If you'd like to pause the video and try to write it down in the comments below, I'd welcome you to. It's something that I think is very nuanced and probably has gone over the heads of most content creators and high-level players and people that generally are in touch with the game and in the meta game and know a lot about breakpoints and the numerical information, so props to you if you can go down there and get it. So pause the video and see if you can write it. Alright, let's see how smart you are. The answer is shoot it again. Here's the thing about Hipster. If you play it like a focus shot M1 or just normal M1 that is configured for tap firing, you're gonna have a bad time. And that's why I greatly understand why people have a bad time with it. You have to stop caring about breakpoints. You have to stop caring about where each bullet is going. If you try to fire this gun at the maximum rate of fire at 6-ish rounds a second, probably a little lower because nobody's perfect, and you try to keep track of which weak point and which bug and which armor plate each one of those bullets is hitting, you're going to have a lot on your plate. So here's what you do. Look at the enemies and pull the trigger until everything stops moving. The phrase of the day is simplicity's strength. Hipster is better if you hit weak points. Hipster is better if you utilize focus shots to stun enemies before killing them. But before any of that, Hipster is better because it fires 6-ish rounds a second. If you're sitting in a choke point with your team of 3 other players, and the gunner and the driller are cutting down every grunt, and your only objective is to shoot that one tri-jaw that comes through the choke before somebody else kills it, then yeah, Active Stability System is probably the one for you. But if you are out in the open, fighting multiple types of enemies, melee, ranged, tank, light, threat, grabs, all at the same time, the ability to forget about focus shots, worry about nothing other than tracking weak points through the crowd, hitting priority targets, and using all of the other skills that the scout and every other class in the game possesses inherently before any build is invaluable. I heavily oppose the argument of total damage and total ammo being a boon for basically any weapon in this game before damage and DPS and flexibility and control of situations. All of that ammo related stuff and total over the course of a mission economy always has a backseat to moment gameplay. But Hipster has incredibly fast, easy, reliable, moment-to-moment gameplay, as well as magazine after magazine that you can empty into enemies before you run out of ammo. There is very, very, very few situations in DRG that you can get into where you will not be able to kill every enemy, even in multiplayer games, with Hipster alone before you're able to reach a resolution, either getting your teammates up, resupplying, or ending the mission. And this is where we come to the really unsatisfying part of this section, which is, I've used this thing a lot. I've been in a lot of situations with it. This isn't just, I threw on active stability system, played 3 200 Morkite missions, and now I'm gonna tell you why it's bad. Full disclosure, I have not played any M1000 overclock other than hoverclock as much as I have played Hipster. I've probably played at least 40% of all of my scout missions with Hipster. And I'll tell you for one thing for a fact, it makes me want for nothing. Let me explain what I mean. Core lock, kills sprouts, does DPS to the heart. Elimination, kills sentinels. Hive guard flaps, DPSs the hive guard during the damage phase. Breaks armor on the OG dread and does DPS during the damage phase. Twins, breaks the armor and exposes their vulnerable flesh and does DPS to them. Industrial sabotage, you can kill the caretaker with just this weapon. Salvage, you can hold a zone with cryo grenades and Hipster. Mining missions, you can clear multiple caves before you run out of ammo. Egg hunts, drop 1 resupply in the corner, pull 4 eggs, you can kill every enemy in the room and resupply when you're done off 1 inventory of ammo with Hipster. Would it be better to switch over to a Bullets of Mercy special powder build because I have a caustic sludge pump driller joining my team for the next 2.5 missions, and synergizing with him would get me 50% more total damage if I followed him around and DPS Praetorians with him? Maybe. But you know what also works? Letting that driller join my team, continuing to use Hipster, and still quickly, easily, effortlessly dispatching high-value targets, the occasional swarm of grunts, healthy targets, stationary threats, and that's what we're getting down to, is simplicity's strength. Should you switch over to that AI stability engine GK2 in order to get a little bit more damage during the damage phases on this elimination mission? Maybe, but what's it gonna be like while the dread armor is up? While the sentinels are alive and aggroed onto you, and you're waiting for your teammates to open the dread armor for you. Why do that? Break the dread armor with Hipster, DPS the dread with Hipster. Don't make it overcomplicated for yourself. Use your secondary as a way to bolster your build, to support Hipster in the very few situations where it is weaker. Because yes, if we take Hipster, put it in a vacuum, and then compare the best possible scenario of another build to it, yeah, it will get outclassed in pretty much every niche scenario. 2 Trijaws is probably better done with focus shots. 10 Grunts is probably better done with EFS. Proccing Fire Spread and a Choke, well, I mean, nothing you can do with the M1000 can do that, so that makes aggressive venting on Drac look really good. Doing a 400 Morkite mission without a resupply? Electrifying Reload on GK2 is probably your guy. But here's the thing. Hipster can do everything. It may not do it as well as the best option you could take instead of it, but Hipster can go through every mission in the game, cover to cover, with no thrash, no wanting, no pain, no thoughts of, man, I wish I had something else. AI Stability Engine is an incredible overclock, but whenever you put it up against the armor phase of a Dread, a Caretaker's Vent phase, the rocks on Escort, or a Brundle if you don't take the armor break mod, it feels bad. And as it should. Every overclock should have strengths and weaknesses. It should be stronger in some areas and weaker in others. Hipster is generally as strong, if not a little weaker, in every scenario in the game with twice as much ammo. Supercooling Chamber is going to kill a Praetorian slightly faster than Hipster will. But when I turn around from killing that Praetorian and find 3 slashers, which weapon is going to be more effective at dealing with different situational targets? Hipster drops Trijaws 10% slower than Active Stability System, but Hipster massively out DPS's Active Stability System against boss-type enemies, or situations where you just can't hit a weak point for one reason or another. AI Stability Engine on GK2 is even more egregious about this. If you're not hitting weak points, you are having a bad time. So whenever that trawler comes shooting across the sand at you, weak point buried under the ground, what are you to do? Shoot at it, not be able to hit it in the weak point with a mediocre amount of damage, wait for it to pop out of the sand and hope that it doesn't grab anyone in the meantime? There's really not a perfect solution to that. Hipster has the perfect solution. Open fire until it dies. And as it turns out, that tends to be the answer with pretty much every enemy in the game. Doesn't clear grunts as well as EFS, but I'd love to see you kill a Dread with EFS. It's gonna be awful. There's very few overclocks in the game, and even fewer in the Scout's primary slot, that have no horrible downsides. No situation where they don't wither, where they don't feel awful. Say you take out Cryo Cannon on Driller, and then you run into a Nemesis. You picked the wrong weapon without ever knowing that you did, until it was too late. You took Carpet Bomber on Thunderhead, and now you have an Omen, so you're gonna struggle to kill it. Nemesis versus Hipster, shoot it until it dies. Omen versus Hipster, shoot it until it dies. Now let's talk about one of the most agonizing, cringeworthy things that I hear about the game in general. It's not your job to kill X as Scout. Normally people say grunts, but I've heard this about all sorts of things. Other than, completely forgetting that solo play exists in the game, the people that say this, I can't shake the image from my mind of the Scout that hides behind the Driller and the Gunner and just tries to pick off Mactera, Web Spitters, I don't know. I think a lot of people fall into this pitfall of thinking Scout can't actually fight or scrap and shouldn't fight or scrap with just general hordes of enemies. Is the Gunner more efficient at it? With something like Neurotoxin Payload killing 20 grunts? Absolutely. No disagreement on that there. But if you're playing at a level where you have a Neurotoxin Payload Gunner in the team already, the odds of you Nitro starving, probably pretty low. So instead of shifting all of the burden of those 30 grunts onto him, maybe you'd actually kill some of them. Maybe you could stun that slasher with a focus shot, just to give yourself a little more time to figure out how to kill it. Should you be killing HVTs? Absolutely. But if you look at the way DRG plays these days, you don't see any players ignoring Trijaws, waiting for the Scout to come by and shoot it. Everyone is focusing on HVTs. It goes the other way. Should that Neurotoxin Gunner be taking his attention off of those grunts that he can kill in 5 seconds to shoot at a Trijaw that hasn't even aggroed on him yet? Probably not, but he's going to, because Trijaws are threatening. He knows that that Trijaw is much more of a threat to him than any amount of grunts that he can run away from. So this is where it really takes the wind out of your sails whenever you say, well, the Scout should only be fighting this, only be fighting this. The Scout should be killing everything that moves, and that goes for every class in the game. Whether he's better or worse at it than the other classes in the mission, if there even are any, is perfectly valid. A Scout with Hipster is going to have a much harder time killing 30 Swarmers than one Engineer turret. So in that situation, yeah, you probably shouldn't be sitting on the other side of the cave, lighting up Swarmers until they're all dead. You should probably just run towards a turret. That being said, if your NG is dead and his turret isn't built, or out of ammo, or you don't have an Engineer in your team, you're gonna have to figure it out. So, paltrily saying, oh, it's not your job, don't do it, so we shouldn't emphasize gear that is good at doing it. Which is why saying, it's not your job, so we shouldn't care about it, is a weak, feeble, and stupid argument to make against gear that is good at everything. Well, it's not Scout's job to do everything. Well, why shouldn't it be? Why shouldn't I be able to get that Nitro on the ceiling and kill grunts, and stun lock that Praetorian and kill it, and kill that Trijaw, and kill that Menace? Why not? This is something I've talked about in the past, which is if nothing's there to fight, Should the gunner be sitting there waiting for Scout to go 5 feet up the wall and get that nitra? Fuck no. Shoot a zipline and get up there. In the same way, if you're out of essential stuff to do to progress the mission, then yeah, you should be fighting everything that moves as Scout. And here's the real bitter pill to swallow, is that no amount of breakpoints, banking damage while you're aiming between targets, spreadsheets, thresholds, and all this stuff is going to outweigh raw experience, time in the caves, and being in this environment with these different weapons. Which is why I'm not here to say that Active Stability System is the worst thing in the world, or EFS doesn't do anything right, because I haven't played 500 missions with EFS. Because I guarantee you, no amount of spreadsheets, calculations, probability graphs, stun chances, or anything in between is going to teach you as much as watching all 3 of your teammates get one shot by a Crassus detonator while you have no nitra in the bank and just one inventory of ammo with a different primary. But I will tell you that the overwhelming collective mimetic mental illness that Scout can't fight certain enemies, needs to only shoot HVTs and run away is wrong. I'm not trying to shame anyone for falling victim to this, because I did myself. If you go back to my Scout guide, I literally say, you're not supposed to be in there fighting everything, you're sitting in the back line picking off important targets. I literally was on the wrong side of this conversation.
Because the Scout plays very differently than the other 3 classes in the game. You cannot hold your ground. You cannot plant your feet and fight bugs. You have to play on your feet all the time. You have to shoot while grappling through the air. You have to perform actions faster than anyone else, because you cannot defend yourself like they can.
Aim for the best and prepare for the worst. You should be ready to do everything as Scout. Gunner is more ammo efficient, killing all this random trash coming at us, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't be capable of doing it. Especially when that capability only costs me 0.2 seconds time to kill on a tri-jaw, or 1 extra shot into that slasher to drop it. This isn't an argument of saying anything about M1000 is not viable, or worse on paper or numerically, or a bad choice to take. EFS isn't my cup of tea, but I see what it does well. The point being, people saying that Hipster doesn't do anything well, which is just patently false. You can look back historically. I have proven that this is a reliable tool. For every video that I make that contains Hipster, I played 100 missions with it off screen. If it wasn't good, I wouldn't be using it. There's no paycheck in the mail to me to advocate for something that isn't good. If it wasn't good, I wouldn't be using it, I wouldn't be advocating for it, and I wouldn't care if people called it bad. If you can deliver to me a M1000 build that has a better effect across every target in the game at the same time, without any tweaking of mods, any support from any other weapons, any support from teammates, any niche situations that thrusts an alternative to the front, because as it stands right now, I can equip Hipster and play DRG until the end of time and not feel like I'm missing anything from a build. What is Hipster worse than the best in slot weapons at? Pretty much everything. There is nothing that you can do with a gun in DRG that you can't find a slightly better alternative than Hipster for. However, I don't know when that ohm is going to show up. I don't know when the Coillock's going to show up. I don't know when I'm going to need that best in slot weapon, and there's no way to know. And that's just the nature of the game. Nobody knows exactly what we're going to encounter in a mission. Nobody knows the exact contents of that next cave. So while I may not be taking the best weak point, the best HVT killer, the best grunt clearing weapon in the primary slot, I am taking the most reliable, dependable, high DPS, and flexible tool to every mission that I play. Is that Tri-Jaw 10 missions from now gonna get a shot off where I could have one-shot it with Active Stability System? Yeah, maybe. But 20 missions from now, when all of my teammates are dead, and I have to kill every type of enemy, even the ones that I shouldn't be fighting, in a single cave, I'm gonna be glad that I took Hipster. I'm not gonna be hurting for aggressive venting, Active Stability System, AI stab. All of that falls to the wayside and out of memory whenever I have the most reliable, flexible tool in my hand in every mission I play. Is it boring to play the same overclock all the time? Not really for me. That is a perfectly valid reason not to use Hipster all the time. This isn't to say that you have to use Hipster to be good, or you should be using Hipster if you don't like the way it plays. That's not the argument at all. The argument is to shut down the people that sit there, dink on spreadsheets, whether they agree with me or not. Whether you're arguing that Hipster is good or bad because of total ammo, breakpoints, or anything like that, what enemies it can one-shot, what enemies it can't, I have one thing to say to you. You're just not playing enough. You're just not getting into enough situations with the weapons to see their faults and to see the strengths of alternatives. Loading into the sandbox and killing 20 grunts with electrifying reload makes for a great gift to send to someone in DRG main whenever they disagree with you. But I'll tell you, whenever you actually try to play that overclock and you come head to head with that nemesis, you're going to be rethinking some things. Who am I kidding? You're not actually playing the game. But I can tell you that I outplay pretty much every scout that I can find gameplay of, not just in combat, but in metagame progression. There's very few people that can push objectives, fight, and have an overall view of the game space and deal with enemies as well as I can with Hipster in hand. That's a pretty difficult comparison to make, as builds are only one small aspect of how well someone plays at the game, but I will tell you that I'm never struggling to find somewhere to drop a focus shot that I just charged. 6 rounds into a weak point, maybe 4 of them miss, that's none of my business, but hopefully there's some takeaway that you have that maybe things aren't bad just because they're slightly numerically worse. They don't hit a breakpoint. Because when the only difference between Hipster and the latest and greatest focus shot build is 1 extra click in a quarter of the time that it takes to charge a focus shot, it really makes you reevaluate some things. And since I'm not going to be able to get through this video without talking about it, I'm not talking about modded. I know Hipster's not good in modded, and if you only play modded, you probably don't think Hipster's good, and it's pretty easy to understand why. And if you can't see that for yourself, and step outside of your own body and be aware that, hey, maybe I only think certain things are good, because I've only played 6 times 200 Morkite for the last 200 hours, you know, a little bit of self-reflection goes a long way. Just to be clear, in case it was never said anywhere on this channel, is whenever we're talking about balance, builds, the way to play the game, modding is not relevant to that conversation. A player-made difficulty that's going to get replaced by something new 3 weeks from now doesn't really matter. Doesn't really hold a lot of bearing to me. Maybe I'll be interested in modded difficulty someday, but for the time being, you should just assume that whenever I talk about the game, I'm talking about the game, not player-made content. Thank you for watching, and have a nice day.